Well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, whenever you might be happening to watch this. My name is Karen Eifler, and I serve as the director of Collegium. And I imagine that we're welcoming a number of Collegium alums to this new series. It's a couple of years old, where we try to provide a little booster shot of Collegium joy at least once every semester, with a topic that means something to Collegium alums. Last year, 22-23, we focused on how a couple of ways that Collegium might have an influence on the way people approach their teaching. And we know that another really important dimension of a scholar's work is research and writing and scholarship and all kinds of creative activities. And so this year, we're spending a couple of webinars on how Collegium might have an impact on those creative endeavors. How might a sacramental or a prophetic imagination contribute to the work of a scholar in Catholic higher education? To shed some light on that today, we have a panel of folks who have worked together on a really intriguing set of approaches that resulted in a first book publication for Sister Jeanne Clark just this past year in her 80s. And I think that's great news for all of us. And all of us are always smarter than one of us. And so I am also happy to invite Carole Sargent of Georgetown University and Timothy Casey, a colleague, both of whom are Collegium alums, to talk with us about the process that led not just to Sister Jeanne Clark's book, but it's, from what they've told me, a really enriching experience in their own spirituality and approaches to scholarly activity. So I'm going to turn things over now to Carole Sargent. Welcome, Carole.
Thank you. And, and Tim and I will each speak briefly, and then we've left a little more time for Sister Jeanne, since, this is her story. But I came to Collegium, I was a brand new Catholic. I entered the church in 2008-9, because, you go through that RCIA year. And I was nominated for it by Dennis McAuliffe, who some of you may know. And I came in 2009 to St. John's Abbey in Collegeville. And what a great place to start the journey, because there were contemplative opportunities with the monks there at St. John's, but also liturgical press is there. And I didn't know it, but later, above me, there's that book, Transform Now Plowshares. Long time later, like 15 years later, I would publish a book with liturgical press. So my little piece of my future was kind of hiding there. I had a vision of community from the time in my early 20s when a dear friend of mine, Keenan Dakota, moved to Twin Oaks in Louisa, Virginia. It's the oldest running commune in the country. And everyone thought he just went for a little, he was being young and kind of wild. Well, he's now lived there for 45 years. And I learned through him about community. I spent 3 weeks at Twin Oaks. And, but, I lived like just a normal person in a house for years. And then I had a faith crisis after the 2016 presidential election. I was so upset. I sold my house and wanted to move to a faith community. And I moved in with the Religious of the Sacred Heart, they were doing an experiment at that time in intentional community. I lived with them as a laywoman, and I helped them open Anne Montgomery House in Washington, D.C. And that becomes important because Sister Jeanne knew the late Sister Anne Montgomery, who was a great anti-nuclear peace activist. And Sister Jeanne was an anti-nuclear peace activist. So you'll slowly see, well, not even slowly, I'll do it quickly, but you'll see how this comes together. I left the sisters' house with their blessing to start my own community. We call it the Beehive Interfaith House in Georgetown. And we said we have a Catholic core, we have a Catholic way of praying and being together, but we're interfaith, and we welcome people of all faiths or no faith who are like-minded and want to join with us in prayer and spirituality. And guess who was one of the first house guests? My first house guest was Sister Megan Rice, who you'll see up here. She's in the middle of that trio, and a peace activist. But her very good friends were Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, and they were my first dinner guests. They are the co-founders of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And Mary Evelyn and John introduced me to Sister Jeanne, and she's going to explain a little more about that. So I won't steal her thunder from that story, but that's the way that I, met her. And I support faculty scholars in publishing. You can see behind me these books for the past 17 years. I've been at Georgetown for 26, but for 17 years, I've supported faculty in publishing. And we learned something that began at Collegium for me, and that was the process of accompaniment, in Spanish, acompañamiento. I said it with an Italian accent because I speak intermediate Italian. I saw all my Spanish like it's Italian. But it's where you accompany a person. It's modeled, we model it partly on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, but also partly on other contemplative processes from the Benedictines, from the Franciscans. There's so many models from the sisters. And so this yields writing not by force, but by increments in love. And you don't write by sitting yourself in a chair and locking yourself in a room. Have you read that advice? It's terrible. Go be alone and go, suffer in this punitive model and try to grind out these words. And we do exactly the opposite. We have dialogue, we pray together, there's no hurry, and gradually the story appears. For people in attendance who may want to publish, this is a radical departure. And this is how, and I'm going to, Sister Jeanne is going to explain the concept. It was her original concept, but we practiced it together of mutual spiritual direction. She'll explain what that is too. But I'm going to hand it to Tim now because I invited him to the project halfway through. She and I worked together for 3 years approximately, and Tim came in between a year and a half into it. And I not only remembered him from Collegium, but he and I have worked together on other projects ever since he was at the John Main Center. So with that, I introduce you to my friend and colleague, Tim Casey.
Well, thank you, Carole. I promised Dr. Sargent that I would not read my comments, but as you can kind of hear in my throat, I'm getting over a bit of a cold or a flu. I'm happy to note it is not COVID. So I'll look at them and I'll kind of go between the two.
Okay.
So my name is Timothy Casey. I was the representative from Georgetown University to Collegium in 2011. And I was representing Georgetown while I was director of the John Main Center for meditation. At that same time, I was doing my novitiate as a Benedictine oblate. And I'm actually zooming to you today from Siena, Italy, where my Benedictine mother house is. And I'm partly here for my 10-year anniversary of my oblation. I worked with Dr. Carole Sargent and Dr. Dennis McAuliffe, who was mentioned earlier, both Collegium alums, to write a short segment for Collegium a few years later. It must have been around 2015. About our work at Georgetown and how we continue to engage among all of us, alumni of Collegium. And I think that this collaboration is very much a product or a fruit of Collegium because, Carole, actually, I was a student, I was a scholarship student at Georgetown in 2003 through 2007.
Yeah.
But we really became friends and colleagues many years later. And so it was in 2021 that I was invited by Dr. Sargent to join her and Sister Jeanne Clark during their weekly spiritual exercises during the pandemic. And Dr. Sargent knew I had previously worked on a project with the Catholic Sisters Initiative at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation and thought perhaps, I might like to meet Sister Jeanne. So what started as a weekly meeting for an hour Zoom talk about our lives on lockdown and discern needs, spiritual reflections, increasingly became us listening to Sister Jeanne. And her stories just, they captured your imagination, your attention. And they often talk of the Irish gift of gab. And with Sister Jeanne, it was something more than that. It was more akin to the gift of tongues. Her stories were relatable, and they filled you with a deep sense of purpose. Now, it was Dr. Sargent who was the first to click the record button on Zoom. And I have to admit, I'm not even sure if I knew there was a record button on Zoom when we first did this. So she did it, and it was really great because we were able to then go back and listen to what Sister Jeanne had said, her thoughts and her words. And so we started talking about a media project. And I thought it might be easiest to take Sister Jeanne's stories that she told to the children from the farm and turn them into maybe a little short animation or maybe a children's book. But we talked about that, and we realized that there were these other stories which were more mature and important to the overall picture. Stories of incarceration, stories of racism, stories of nuclear fire. And so we eventually decided that instead we wanted to focus on a book of her complete life. And so we asked Sister Jeanne to tell us a story from her life, which Dr. Sargent would record. Dr. Sargent would then transcribe this conversation and share it with Sister Jeanne, and then Sister Jeanne would use that transcription to write a chapter. So once that was written, we would then meet the next week, and we three would read the chapter out loud on Zoom. And each of us, as we're reading it, would go back and offer edits. And we would do that. And then by the third week, we would basically come to satisfaction. And we'd say, okay, that's a chapter. And so then we would go. And we just went on doing that process for several weeks until we had a full book. So this was a very innovative process of writing, shepherded by the experience of Dr. Sargent. And it was aided by these new modern technologies. And it allowed us to write a book together in the course of a year across 3 cities, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Long Island, New York. So by the end of it, we knew what was written was good. We were confident of that. But we were still filled with a bit of surprise when Sister Jeanne's first choice for publisher, Orbis Books, accepted the proposal. Besides being a fantastic publisher, Orbis is led by Robert Ellsberg, the son of the late Daniel Ellsberg, who was a support to her during her trial, though he was not allowed to testify. I'm happy to say that Sister Jeanne's book is in the money, which is definitely not always the case for books in this category, and her book continues to gain support. We also just released the audiobook after Sister Jeanne agreed to record her voice at Hofstra University's NPR station. And I cannot encourage you more to listen to the stories the way they were told to us. Sister Jeanne's voice, adds so much. Since I now work as a producer of documentaries, I'm working on trying to find a way to get the funding and support for a documentary based on the book. And I intend to use her voice from these recordings for some of the film. I cannot thank Dr. Sargent enough for introducing me to Sister Jeanne. She has added so much warmth and wisdom into my life. And I think, as you hear from her, as I'm going to hand it over to her, you will see what I mean. And I really much encourage you to read her book, to hear about her life. And I'm really there it is right there. Carole has it. But I'm really, really thankful for Carole introducing me to Sister Jeanne and having Sister Jeanne in my life. So with no further ado, the big show, let me introduce Sister Jeanne.
Well, thank you, Tim, very much. And as I was preparing for this panel and thinking about the process of the book, I wrote some thoughts down, and then it was Carole who reminded me that there is a chapter in my book that I had forgotten about that really tells the whole process. So I would like to read that to you today. And it's the last chapter of the book. It's chapter 29, One More Story. Please allow me to tell you one more story. Without this story, you would not be reading this book. There would be no book. In October 2019, I learned about a conference taking place at Georgetown University. It was called Thomas Berry and the Great Work. Thomas was a person who had so much influence, not just on my life, but on the creation of Homecoming Farm. I wanted to be at this conference with others who shared my love for Thomas and were involved in doing what he called the great work, which in his words, quote, "The great work is to carry out the transition from a period of human devastation of the earth to a period when humans would be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner," end quote. Jeanne McPartland, who was a shareholder in our organic farm and had a deep love for Thomas, wanted to accompany me to the conference. But because I had limited funds and the cost of hotels close to Georgetown, Washington, D.C. was very expensive, we set out to find a way to be able to attend. We knew that Mary Evelyn Tucker was to be a speaker at the event, and I contacted her to ask if she might know of some cheaper accommodations. That was the beginning of this beautiful story that created the book you are about to finish. Mary Evelyn led us to a small house within walking distance of the university, and there we met Professor Carole Sargent, a woman with a vision and a very large heart, who was just beginning to establish an interfaith community for global scholars in Georgetown for short research visits. She also welcomed people in religious life who were either doing research at the Jesuit University or there for conferences and symposia. This, quote, beehive house grew out of her 2+ years living with the Society of the Sacred Heart Sisters and helping them open Anne Montgomery House, a faith-based peace community near Catholic University. For a few days, Jeanne and I found a home in D.C., a place that welcomed and nourished us as we attempted to grow in the understanding of what it really means to do the great work. Within just hours of arriving and getting settled, I saw a photo on the bookshelf in the living room of this home. It was a beautiful photo of Sister Anne Montgomery, who was now deceased, but who I came to know through a passion we both shared in life, to put an end to the Trident submarine and a world with nuclear weapons. When I met Anne, she had a history of resistance to the Trident in Groton, Connecticut, where it was made, and I was resisting at its final destination, the Bangor submarine base on the Kitsap Peninsula in the state of Washington. And so I asked Carole, "I see you know it, Sister Anne Montgomery." She didn't meet Anne before she died, she said, but she did know her protege, Sister Megan Rice, who joined us that evening. Then I began to tell them a story of how I was connected to Anne, and this led to other stories. Carole asked me the next morning at breakfast if I would consider allowing her to record the stories. And that was the beginning of a journey together through stories that began to live again, to be remembered and spoken. I believe telling the stories created the space for a new reality in a relationship that was forming between Carole's life and mine. We were involved not just in a task, but in a new creation. I spent a year and a half meeting with Carole on Zoom every Wednesday afternoon, just telling one story after another. We wondered together where this was all leading, but we let go of any expectations and were happy to just allow the stories to lead us. I realize now to create a new way of writing a book based in relationship. After all, this is the kind of earth and universe we are living in, where everything is in relationship to everything else. There is no such thing as doing something alone or being a self-made person. We are made up of relationships. I found this experience of telling the stories in relationship to Carole and her life, her vision, her experiences, to be a way of revelation and emergence. I felt connected to the process of the earth and universe in the very telling of the stories. And in the end, although I did the writing, this book emerged as a gift. But that's not the end of the story. Another character in relationship entered halfway through when Carole asked me if she could invite her filmmaker friend, Tim Casey, to join us on Wednesday afternoons for an hour on Zoom. Tim saw the possibility of making a film in the telling of the stories. He became another person involved in the writing of this book as we met for yet another year or more, with the stories as our connecting link. It is amazing to me how a relationship developed between me and Tim, a man I have never met face to face, who lives thousands of miles away on the west coast of the country. It helped me see how wonderful technology made by human hands can be such a source of discovery and creativity if used in a way leading to goodness and life. What some see as the dreaded Zoom calls and meetings was for me an instrument of connection and creativity. I learned a lot about Tim Casey, his life and work, his deep commitment to silence and meditation, the source, I'm sure, of his creative work. I felt gifted by his presence and his encouragement as the pages of this book were long. I cannot end the story of the writing of this book without including all the people at the Deep Time Network who gathered together with the leadership of Jennifer Morgan and Stephen Martin to create new realities out of the understanding that we are all the universe, conscious of itself, with awesome powers to create a world of mutuality and celebration. I was taking one of the courses offered by the Deep Time Network while at the same time meeting with Carole Sargent and Tim Casey. I therefore was meeting each week again on Zoom with people from all parts of the country and world, people from Australia, the Philippines, Mexico, and China, people from the East and West and Middle of America. We all were connecting out of a deep desire to live the new story of the universe and be a part of creating a new consciousness for all of us humans and more than humans. We're living in mutuality within the community of life. This connection that I felt with all of these people and with the rivers and mountains, all the creatures, and especially with the relationship that deepened between myself and the Great South Bay in Long Island, held within it for me the energy I needed to believe that I could be the author of this book. It is with deep gratitude that I tell this story of the writing of this book, and all the members of the community of life who helped me express new insights and understandings, leading me deeper into the truth and true liberation. I thank Jim Douglas for that question heard so many years ago. He had asked, just how far would you like to go in? I invite all of us to treasure the stories of our life and to get to know the story of the universe, which beckons all of us to go all the way in.
Amen. That's such a beautiful reading. Thank you. What
Thank
a
you,
pleasure. Yeah.
Sister Jeanne. We are all made up of relationships. I think you might have single-handedly redeemed Zoom for me. And I have a few questions for all of you and invite you to dive in when you feel moved to respond. One, it occurs to me that Zoom actually made this work possible. And I'm still kind of trying to lean into that, get my head around that Zoom is a good thing, not just the spawn of Satan. Do you think that is this something that actually technology makes better than face to face? Since we're all spread really thin, we're all spread over the globe. Even if we live in the same city, our time is tends to get gobbled up. And I'm wondering if this might be an instance of a new technology being exactly what we need at this moment in time for telling human stories, which is such an ancient instinct that we have. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I'd like to jump right in there because I believe it's true. Teilhard de Chardin, spoke of the noosphere, this other level of the earth beyond the atmosphere, the biosphere, the noosphere, which is the human consciousness connecting. And Zoom and technology are helping that to happen because we can communicate globally with people who don't know and who have this new consciousness. When I watch the new news on TV, it's nowhere to be seen. No one would ever know there's a new consciousness coming to birth on the earth among humans. And on Zoom, I can participate in it. And I have found deeper relationships with some people deeper than some of the people I live with, or even my own family members. So I think it is true. It's a wonderful, of course, it has its dark side, as we know.
And I think that Lady and the Tramp was a favorite movie of mine when I was a little girl, the one from the 60s, or it might have even been from the late 50s, I don't know. But there's the twilight bark, when the dogs bark to each other from different neighborhoods and send a message. And also we know this is where yodeling comes from. Yodeling in the mountains was actually a way of calling from one group to another group. And you could even recognize people by their signature calls. So we have these things we've always tried to do this. And they say when the telegraph existed, people started making chat rooms. That was in the 1800s, right? So there's definitely a very human impulse underneath of this, which I think is to create the circle and be in it. And Collegium does that. It creates that circle. And, you can create it with intention or you can create it by accident, but I think we're meant to do it. I think it's who we are.
Yeah, and I think that
Zoom helps. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to add was, one of the things about Collegium is that you connect with all these people with other institutions, but you also connect with people who've gone from your own institution. But then what happens when you move on? I mean, I moved out of higher ed, and I still collaborate often with Georgetown. But this technology was, before I met Sister Jeanne, it was a way for Carole and I to stay connected. And she knew, my connection to, this kind of discernment conversations. And so, I think that, yes, it was used productively to create a product, a book, but, it was also a way for Collegium alumni to stay in contact and continue these discussions. I mean, even this program that you're running now, I mean, it can be used. It's like any technology. This is the classic Nobel Peace Prize. It can, it was dynamite for mining or for weapons, nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. And I think that's the case with social media and Zoom, and even one day, as AI continues to grow, it's a question of how we use it.
Yeah.
That leads me into another question that I think each of you would have a slightly different perspective to add. Sister Jeanne, your stories are so personal and vivid. And I think a lot of people listening are thinking about their own scholarship as an organic chemist or as a poet or I don't know, cognitive psychologists. And I'm wondering if this model, so what do we have here? We have a religious sister and peace activist, we have a documentary filmmaker, and we have someone who, as I understand, your primary obligation, Carole, is supporting the scholarship of your colleagues at Georgetown from idea to publication. And do you think that there are parts of what you have experienced so fruitfully that would lend itself to what people might consider a more traditional version of scholarship that's not human story, but that is the unpacking of an atom or breakthroughs in, I don't know, particle physics?
I think we have to talk about Daniel here. Sister Jeanne, could you speak about Daniel?
Yeah. Well, Daniel was a child when I met him. He was born actually at Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action in the community resisting the Trident submarine. And when I went in front of the train carrying nuclear weapons to the Trident submarine base, I carried Daniel's photo in my Bible with me, and it fell to the floor, to the ground. And when I was being arrested, I didn't know I was going to say the words, but I used his photo and I just held it up and kept saying, his name is Daniel, and he's asking us to stop the train. And it was really that I was doing that for all the children. You know, he was representing all the children. And I wanted Daniel to have a life, to be able to grow up.
Yeah.
Well, he did. And he skipped high school. He was at George Washington University in Seattle at the age of 15, I think, and went to MIT as a 17-year-old with 2 masters, one in chemistry and one in biology, I think it was. And now he's a research professor at Stanford University. He mentors all the PhD candidates in biology. One of the last conversations I had with him, he explained his research to me, and he said he was working on the communal activity of molecules, because no one molecule can do anything without being in relationship to others. So you see how it's all connected.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I think all those gifts that people have, whether they're in chemistry or biology or they're doing data for technology or telling stories or poets or artists, it's all the gift that we are given to the universe, and we're all so important. And we're all so different. Differentiation is so important in the universe. So I'm sure that this, yes, can be translated into other ways.
Yeah. Well, I also work with faculty in circles and groups. And I would never believe 17 years ago when I began this job at Georgetown, I used to be an English professor, I wouldn't have thought that faculty would sit in a circle every week and talk about their work, but they do. And stuff does grow and arise out of that. And one of the books that I taught was Frankenstein. And if I can share my screen for a second, Frankenstein was created out of a circle at this villa. And that is Villa Diodati. And this is the group, right? These are the people, Mary Shelley, Dr. John Polidori. She was Mary Godwin then. She hadn't married Percy Shelley yet. He was there, and Lord Byron. And there's a movie reenactment of their circle. But it occurred to me, Frankenstein would not exist had they not told ghost stories together. And then she had a dream, and the book actually rose out of a dream. And so if you think about it, there was nothing about writing an outline, looking at other work to see how you fit in. This arose from within her. And I think in our faculty groups, we allow the same thing to happen. We do not put colleagues together. I said, you cannot be with someone from your own department. They have to be from other programs. They have to be from other places. And again, it's a collegium thing too, because there wasn't a soul there from Georgetown but me, right? And so you also have to let go of your context a little bit, and be with someone else who may think differently and see differently. I think I really think you asked the question, Karen, when you said, you know, do you think there's this kind of a seed there or a model there? I would say absolutely. You know, explore that more. Instead of trying to go from the brain to the page, try to see what comes up from the belly, from the gut, from the back of the mind, you know, these secret places, from prayer. You know, we prayed together. And we didn't pray together saying we're going to make a book. If we'd done that, it wouldn't have worked. You know, sooner or later a book arose, but it was never a given. It was never an explicit given.
Carole and I worked together, and we're very honored. We received a Gabriel Award for a documentary short recently.
He received. He
Well,
took me up on
you were a
stage.
part of it. So since then, I've been talking with a few projects, and everybody's asking me about, you know, my next projects and what I'd like to do. And one of the conversations that we've had is the distinction between a religious film and a spiritual film.
Mhm.
And I personally like to focus on, I often say, theodicy. So this question of a person with morals in a very difficult environment trying to understand what the right thing to do is.
Mhm.
And I think too often we just say, well, it's a faith-based content, it's a religious film, and we miss out on so many stories are, by very nature, they're spiritual and religious, and it comes through in the integrity of the story. And it doesn't have to be uniquely religious to actually tell a story that is about God. And so I'm not sure if that relates to your question, but I thought I would offer that because that's been a recent discussion.
Well, for years, Tom showed Babette's Feast, and that wasn't a religious story, but he used it as an allegory of the table, and it was beautifully. I don't know if you guys still do Babette's Feast, but I remember thinking, this is a thing.
Yeah, it's still part of the repertoire.
Yeah.
As our time winds down a little bit, I have one question. I'm sure somebody wants to know, how do I get started? I like this idea of seeing everything as interconnected. I like the idea of getting out of my silo. I really like the idea either of being supported in my work, or as a senior faculty member, senior administrator. I really like the idea of being a big-hearted, imaginative mentor for the people I shepherd. If I want to get started and I don't know how to get started in this sort of collaborative, spiritual, receptive, we're going to dive in without exactly knowing what's going to come out of it. What would be just a few words of advice from each of you for getting started?
Bring me to your campus. I want to come talk to your people, because it is fun. It's like sourdough starter. You kind of helps to have a little bit from one that already worked. And you can do it your own way, and everyone will. Nobody's going to go out and run anything like. Somebody asked me what my legacy when it was going to be, and I was going to say to wish the next person well as they do it their own way, right? And you can't imprint how you do it, but and also, and I was kind of kidding, but kind of serious. You really can bring me to your campus. But another thought is, you almost can't screw it up, because if you come with intention to the circle, I like to light a candle. You can also just breathe, maybe have some silence. And then you really, with integrity and giving each person a chance that's kind of equal, so you don't have anyone dominating, you express what's on your heart. I think you're going to get there. We have found that accountability and community work, even in the absence of an expert, because, we do have inner wisdom. We really do. And I think we have collective wisdom too. I really would, now that I've lived in this community, I've run it since 2019, and I've lived with over 500 people. You definitely learn about collective wisdom. You find out you're not the smartest guy in the room, right? You just, sometimes they're right, and you need to say, I'm sorry. So that's fun too.
Thanks, Carole.
And I guess I would say three things. First, and this is given my Benedictine vocation and time as director of the John Main Center, I think it's very important to start with a period of silence, prayer, breaking, the day. I mean, often we just jump into things. So I think that a good moment of prayer, meditation, or silence before starting anything is a great thing. It doesn't have to be long, 5-10 minutes, but I think that's important. Second, I would say, I call you friends. I mean, I think, you can see amongst the three of us that, we have this spiritual connection, but we're all friends. And I think one thing that's lost often in higher ed is there's so much competition when you get into a room with your colleagues.
Yeah.
Too often you forget that, your colleagues, your friends, and you work together. And that goes to my third point, which is there's this great game in acting called, it's an improv game, and it's called Yes and essentially, as you're acting, you're never saying no to anybody. You take whatever the premise is and you build upon it. And it's a really creative way of building out projects rather than trying to stop everything or start over. Just keep building upon it, and then you can find a lot of great from that. So I'll leave the last word to Sister Jeanne.
Which seems only fitting. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I have a very good answer to the question. What comes to my mind always, because I think in terms of the universe story, and that the reality is that we are a cosmogenesis. There is nothing static. Everything is moving. Everything is expanding. And we are at this very moment just here, evolving the universe. That's who we are. And the university, if you think about it, has that name in it, the university.
Yeah.
And I would love to experiment. I know Thomas asked for this. If you read in his book, The Great Work, there's chapters on education in there in the university, where the curriculum of every university should be the universe. And every subject could be taught in that picture. And now when you think of the Webb telescope and, the Hubble before it, and all the learning that's coming to us just at the moment when we humans don't know the answer to any real question. We don't have any solution to any of the problems that we face. There's so many, and it's all unknown. We're living with unknowing. And for me, that would be a great place to begin, with every field in the university, addressing just something of the universe, some lesson in it. That would be a wonderful experiment for a university to do. There is a school in Blairstown, New Jersey. It was close to Genesis Farm, where Sister Miriam McGillis, another Dominican, where the curriculum is the universe, and it's a lower, it's a grammar, grammar school level, but so that's where my mind goes. Not a very easy beginning, but
thank you. I see that we have a question from Thomas in the Q&A, and it occurs to me that each of you answered it. Thomas was interested in how could we start this. Collegium could be a part of it. How can people recreate it? And I think each of you shed a different light, which really goes to your point of we need each other, and we need each other to be our full selves, not to try to be each other, but to be our best selves in any given connection. I'm so glad to have had a little bit of time to chat with you. Carole, I'm going to ask you to hold up that book again. Those of you who have been inspired to get Sister Jeanne's book All the Way In, newly out from Orbis Press, invite you to do that. For those of you who would like to take Carole Sargent up on her offer to come to campus and help grow some seeds of mutual support, mutual beneficence, mutual creativity. Her contact information will be in the text that accompanies this recording. And if you're a planner and you want to look ahead, our January offering in these Collegium booster shots is going to be an engineer whose scholarship has turned to artificial intelligence, and she is going to be talking a little bit about responding to the prophets of AI doom, which seems like a great way to start the new year. We are reminded by our three guests, Carole Sargent, Tim Casey, and Sister Jeanne Clark, that Sister Jeanne was looking for a cheap place to stay around Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and came out of that quest with a book that's doing very well. So our God is indeed a God of great surprises. I wish all of you listening deep blessings. Thank you for joining us. And if you have ideas for these Collegium booster shots, please get in contact with me, Karen Eifler. No, that's not it. Eifler at collegium.org. Going to stop the recording now with thanks to our guests.
You guys.